on the very porch I renovated with my own hands. My family told me I was homeless by my own choice. They thought a power of attorney was a golden ticket to my bank account. They were about to learn that in the world of architecture, an irrevocable trust is the one wall you can never tear down. The humidity in northern Florida always felt like a wet wool blanket, but as I pulled my sedan into the gravel driveway of my childhood home, the air turned ice cold. It was not the air conditioning. It was the sight of the sign staked into the front lawn, its red and white letters screaming a single word that felt like a slap across my face. Sold. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest as I watched a young couple, probably in their late 20s, wandering near the porch. The woman was pointing at the blue hydrangeas, the ones my mother had spent 30 years nurturing with coffee grounds and whispered prayers, and the man was nodding as if he already owned the dirt they grew in. I sat there for a moment, my hand still gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned the color of bone, watching the dust from my tires settle on the porch steps. I had driven 14 hours from New York, my trunk filled with groceries and supplies for my father, only to find that the very ground I was parked on had been bartered away like a used car. The front door creaked open, and Julian stepped out onto the porch, looking every bit the man who had never spent a day worrying about a mortgage. He was wearing a crisp, pale blue linen shirt, the kind that cost $300 at a boutique in Soho, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that he had bought it with the last wire transfer I had sent for our father's medical bills. He didn't look guilty. He looked triumphant. His face lit up with the kind of greasy charisma that had allowed him to slide through life while I built the stairs he climbed on. He raised a hand in a casual wave, a gesture so nonchalant it made my blood simmer. And he didn't even wait for me to open my car door before he started talking. "Elena, darling, you're just in time for the finale," he called out, his voice carrying that familiar, condescending edge that always made me feel like the difficult sister. He walked down the steps toward me, his Italian leather loafers clicking on the stone path I had personally power washed only last summer. I stepped out of the car, the heat hitting me like a physical weight, but I didn't say a word. I stood there, letting the silence of the deep gulf between us fill the space, my expression as flat and unreadable as a stagnant pond. I saw Julian's eyes flicker for a second, a brief flash of the old, boyish fear he used to have when I caught him stealing from my piggy bank. But it was quickly replaced by a mask of smug arrogance. He gestured vaguely toward the young couple and the sold sign, a smirk playing on his lips that said he thought he had finally outsmarted the big city architect. "Everything is wrapped up, signed, and delivered," he said, leaning against my car as if he owned that too. "I knew you'd understand eventually. Dad needs a fresh start, and frankly, so do I. This old place was just a weight around our necks, a dusty relic of a past that's long gone." He reached out as if to pat my shoulder, but I moved just enough to make him miss, my eyes shifting past him to the screen door of the house. There, standing in the shadows behind the mesh, was our father, Arthur. He looked smaller than I remembered, his shoulders hunched and his eyes darting away from mine the moment they met. There was a restless, twitchy energy in his posture, the look of a man who knew he had participated in a heist, but was too tired or too weak to stop it. Julian followed my gaze and let out a short, hollow laugh that grated on my nerves like sandpaper. "Don't go looking for an apology from the old man, Elle. He's the one who gave me the green light. He's tired of the leaks, the taxes, and the memories. We're moving on to bigger and better things, and you should be happy for us. The audacity of it was staggering. A masterpiece of gaslighting that he delivered with a smile. He looked at me, his eyes scanning my sensible work clothes and my modest car, and he shook his head with a mock-sympathetic sigh. I mean, look at you, Elena. You're the big-shot architect in the Big Apple, right? Julian said, his voice dripping with a faux admiration that was actually a sharpened blade of resentment. You've got that fancy apartment and a bank account that probably looks like a phone number. You can buy another house, or 10, without even blinking. He took a step closer, lowering his voice as if he were sharing a profound piece of wisdom. Consider this my last favor. Consider it your final contribution to the family charity. You've always been the strong one, the provider. It's only fair that you let us have this one win so we can finally get out from under your shadow. He actually had the nerve to look proud of himself, as if selling our mother's legacy to pay off his gambling debts was an act of noble independence. I felt the scream rising in my throat, a tidal wave of fury at the decades of my life I had sacrificed to keep this roof over their heads. But I pushed it down, burying it deep where it could turn into something much more useful than a noise. I simply looked at the sold sign one last time, then back at my brother's grinning face, and I felt the first cold gear of a new plan begin to turn in my mind. The dinner that night was a masterclass in atmospheric suffocation, a performance of domesticity that felt as hollow as a rotted oak tree. We sat in the dining room, where the wallpaper was peeling at the corners like sunburned skin, and the air smelled faintly of stale grease and the medicinal scent of my father's liniment. Julian had ordered takeout from a local steakhouse, using my credit card on file, no doubt, and he was sawing into a ribeye with the gusto of a man who hadn't a care in the world. I sat across from my father, Arthur, watching him move his peas around his plate with a silver fork that I had polished every Christmas for 20 years. The silence was heavy, the kind of silence that precedes a calculated ambush, and I leaned into it, practicing the silence of the deep. I didn't ask about the sign in the yard. I didn't ask about the moving boxes stacked in the hallway. I simply waited for the mask of family to be strapped on. Arthur, a dry, raspy sound that he always used when he was about to play the role of the abandoned patriarch. He looked at me with watery eyes, his face a map of wrinkles that he tried to use as a shield against my scrutiny. Elena, it's been so long since you were truly home, and the house has grown so quiet, he started, his voice trembling with a practiced fragility. He went on to describe the long, lonely nights, conveniently forgetting the 3 times a week I had called him, or the private nurses I had paid for out of my New York salary. He spoke of Julian as if he were a saint walking among us, a devoted son who had stayed behind while I chased city lights and glass towers. It was a classic American guilt trip, the kind designed to make a successful woman feel like a traitor for her own independence. Julian nodded solemnly, a smear of steak sauce at the corner of his mouth, playing the part of the exhausted caregiver who had sacrificed everything for the sake of our father's comfort. Internal laughter bubbled me now. But find your kids off father's comfortance of head, in the most of the belief for the father and age. It was a no one said that I turned with pretty stup, but I was unfortunately said. Internal laughter along with your fans. Julian nodded believe and the father says I felt like a very pred. For more emergent senior to comment. Internal laughter of the seven both. It was accused fine from a slightly bloating below into ventinely ready. Internal laughter along with your fans. Julian nodded believe and the father was unfortunately blaying. A smear and sharp as lemon zest, but I kept my face as smooth as a marble headstone. I knew the truth that lay beneath Julian's sacrifices. I had seen the credit card statements, the thousands of dollars spent at Florida casinos, the luxury car leases, and the designer clothes that Julian claimed were essential for business networking. My father knew it too, or at least he chose to look the other way, because Julian provided the only thing Arthur valued more than money: the illusion of being needed. Julian was a parasite, and my father was his willing host, both of them feeding on the life I had built 1,000 miles away. Julian has been my rock, Elena, Arthur continued, his voice gaining strength as he reached the climax of his script. But he's in a bit of a hole, a business venture that didn't go quite as planned. He's a young man with big dreams, and sometimes dreams cost more than we have. The business venture was a euphemism for a gambling debt that probably totaled more than most people's retirement funds. But Arthur framed it as a noble struggle. He looked me dead in the eye, his expression shifting from a plea to an ultimatum. We've decided that selling the house is the only way to make things right. It's a sacrifice for the family, Elena. A way to ensure Julian has a future, and I have a place where I'm not constantly reminded of what I've lost. He spoke of the house, my mother's house, the house I had spent 10 years of my life paying off, as if it were a poker chip he could just toss onto the table to cover Julian's losses. The selfishness was breathtaking. A cold, hard stone of ego wrapped in the velvet of fatherly concern. He expected me to nod, to weep, and to hand over the keys to my own inheritance so his favorite child could continue his slow-motion car crash of a life. Julian didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He just leaned back, picking his teeth with a toothpick, watching me with a smug expectation. He was so certain of his victory, so sure that my sense of duty would override my common sense. Arthur reached into the pocket of his cardigan and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the mahogany table toward me like a poisonous snake. It was the formal agreement for the sale of the property, a document that would strip me of my legal standing and hand the proceeds directly to Julian's creditors. Just sign it, honey, so we can all have some peace, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a that was supposed to be comforting, but felt like a threat. I looked down at the paper, then at the two men who thought they had me cornered, and I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. They wanted a sacrifice, but they had no idea what I was truly willing to give up. As I looked at the yellowed paper sliding toward me, the mahogany surface of the dining table seemed to dissolve, morphing into the memories of a decade ago, when the wood was still polished and my mother's laughter still echoed in this room. 10 years ago, the foundation of this house wasn't just concrete and rebar. It was built from my own blood, sweat, and the quiet erasure of my youth. Back then, while other women my age were buying their first homes or traveling the world, I was living in a studio apartment in New York that was barely larger than a walk-in closet, surviving on black coffee and the sheer will to keep this family afloat. I remembered the bone-deep exhaustion of working 3 jobs simultaneously. By day, I was a junior architect, drafting blueprints for skyscrapers I would never own. But as soon as the sun dipped behind the skyline, I was running plates at a frantic bistro in Soho until 2 in the morning. My weekends weren't for rest. They were spent tutoring college students in calculus, all so I could wire every spare dollar back to Florida. I wasn't just sending money. I was paying for the new roof when the tropical storms tore the old one away, and I was settling the property taxes that my father and brother had conveniently forgotten to mention. I closed my eyes for a split second, and I could almost feel the blistering Florida sun on the back of my neck from 5 years ago. I had taken my only week of vacation to come home, not to relax, but to manually scrape and paint the very fence that Julian now leaned against so carelessly. I remembered the way the white paint dried on my skin like a second layer of dust, and the way my muscles throbbed as I worked under the 90-degree heat. All the while, Julian was calling from the floor of a casino in Las Vegas, his voice buzzing with the fake excitement of a man who thought he was one hand away from a fortune. He claimed he was networking with high-level investors, but the only thing he was investing in was our family's ruin. My father had simply shrugged when I asked why Julian wasn't there to help, telling me that Julian had a sensitive constitution and wasn't built for manual labor like I was. It was then that the first cracks in my heart began to mirror the cracks in the porch steps. The realization that in this family, my value was measured by my utility, while Julian's was guaranteed by his existence. The most vivid ghost of all, however, was the one that lived in the master bedroom upstairs. I could still see my mother, her frame becoming as fragile as parchment paper as the cancer took its final toll. In those quiet, sterile-smelling hours, she had gripped my hand with a strength that defied her illness. She didn't ask me to take care of Julian, and she didn't ask me to forgive my father. She knew them better than I did. Instead, she whispered a single, desperate plea that had become the compass of my life. "Don't let them lose the house, Elena. It's the only piece of earth we truly own. It's your legacy, and it's the only thing that will keep you safe when the world turns cold." I had looked into her fading eyes and made a solemn, unbreakable promise that I would keep the roof over our heads at any cost. I had sacrificed my 30s, my savings, and my peace of mind to honor that word, believing that if I worked hard enough, the American dream would eventually protect those I loved. But standing there now, watching Julian pick his teeth and my father avoid my gaze, I realized that my mother's warning hadn't just been about the bank or the weather. It had been about the parasites sitting right in front of me. They saw this house as a liquid asset, a way to erase their mistakes and fund another round of failures. But to me, it was a sacred trust built on 10 years of my life. Every dollar I had sent home was a brick in a fortress they were now trying to dismantle from the inside. The empathy I once felt for my father's loneliness and Julian's bad luck was evaporating, replaced by a cold, architectural precision. I wasn't the same girl who had painted that fence until her hands bled. I was the woman who had learned how to build structures that could withstand the greatest pressures. And as my fingers brushed the edge of the sale agreement, I knew that the responsible daughter was about to become their most dangerous opponent. The house was silent, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet of a home at rest. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with the image of that sold sign like a neon light flickering in the dark. Around 2 in the morning, I found myself in the living room, driven by a restless instinct to clean. a habit I'd inherited from my mother, who believed you could scrub away bad luck if you just used enough lemon oil. As I reached under the heavy velvet sofa to retrieve a stray coaster, my fingers brushed against something cold and papery. I pulled out a thick, rubber-banded stack of envelopes, their edges curled and stained with what looked like coffee and desperation. These weren't just bills. They were a chronicle of a slow-motion execution. There were final notices from credit card companies, threatening letters from private lenders with names that sounded like shell companies, and, most gut-wrenching of all, a notice of intent to foreclose from a bank I didn't even know we had an account with. Julian hadn't just spent the money I sent. He had mortgaged the very soul of this family, using our mother's legacy as collateral for a life he couldn't afford and a habit he couldn't quit. I sat on the floor, the cold tile pressing against my legs, and began to read through the dates. Some of these letters were a year old, others only a few weeks. My father's name was on many of them, his signature a shaky, unrecognizable scrawl next to Julian's bold, arrogant hand. It became painfully clear that Arthur hadn't been a passive victim of Julian's greed. He had been an active accomplice, a man who chose to sacrifice his daughter's future to keep his son's secrets buried in the Florida sand. My father knew about the gambling. He knew about the predatory loans, and he had spent the last 12 months helping Julian hide the evidence from the one person who was actually paying the bills. He had protected Julian because Julian was the only son close by, a reward for proximity that outweighed a decade of my long-distance devotion. I realized then that my father's love was a transaction. It was conditional on how much of a burden I could remove and how much of a fantasy I could maintain for him. Meanwhile, Julian's capacity for exploitation was truly limitless, a bottomless pit that no amount of my hard-earned New York salary could ever hope to fill. The betrayal tasted like copper in my mouth. I thought about the 3 jobs I had worked, the nights I had slept on a literal floor to save a few extra dollars, and the way I had felt guilty for buying myself a decent winter coat while Julian was likely sitting in an air-conditioned casino lounge sipping bourbon on my dime. Every thank you from my father over the phone for the last year had been a lie, a performance designed to keep the checks coming so the house of cards wouldn't collapse before they could sell the foundation out from under me. They didn't see me as a daughter or a sister. They saw me as a high-yield savings account with no withdrawal limits. The family they kept talking about wasn't a circle of love. It was a pyramid scheme, and I was at the very bottom, holding up the entire structure while they danced on the roof. A bitter, razor-sharp smile touched my lips as I tucked the letters back into the stack. I wasn't the reliable Elena anymore. That woman had died the moment I saw that sign on the lawn. I stood up, my joints popping in the quiet room, and walked over to the hallway where my designer leather briefcase sat on the antique console table. My hand moved to the heavy brass zipper, my fingers tightening around the handle as if it were a hilt. Inside that bag wasn't just a laptop or architectural sketches. It contained the secret weapon I had been forging in the dark for months. Julian and Arthur thought they were playing a game of checkers, using my emotions as their pieces. They had no idea that I had shifted the board to a game of high-stakes chess, and I had already taken their king. I looked at the dark hallway leading to my father's room, then to the stairs where Julian slept off his latest bender, and I felt a cold, surgical sense of purpose. Tomorrow, they would expect me to sign that sale agreement, to weep and to fold. Instead, they were going to find out exactly what happens when you try to demolish a structure built by someone who knows how to make things stand forever. The glow of the laptop screen was the only light in my childhood bedroom, casting long, geometric shadows against the walls I had painted myself 5 years ago. I did not need to turn on the lamp. I knew this room by heart, just as I knew every hairline crack in the family's financial foundation. Julian thought he had ambushed me today with that sold sign, but he had no idea that I had been watching his every move from 3,000 miles away for exactly 6 months. I am a senior architect at one of the top firms in Manhattan. My entire career is built on the ability to foresee structural failures before the first brick is even laid. I do not just look at blueprints. I look at the legal and financial load-bearing walls that keep a project standing. When the money I sent home started disappearing into the void of Julian's ventures a year ago, I did not just ask questions. I set a digital perimeter that he was too arrogant to even imagine. I moved the cursor to the bookmark for the Florida County Clerk's online portal, my fingers dancing across the keys with a precision that would have terrified my brother. Most people my father's age see the internet as a place for recipes or social media. But to me, it is a transparent ledger of human greed. 180 days ago, I had registered my name and the property's parcel identification number for the county's Title Fraud Alert Service. The moment Julian had tried to file a quitclaim deed or any document involving my father's power of attorney, an encrypted notification had pinged my phone in the middle of a board meeting in New York. I had watched in real time as he negotiated with the title company, tracked every inquiry made on the property taxes, and saw the very second the listing agreement was signed. He thought he was moving in the shadows, but he was actually performing on a brightly lit stage, illuminated by the high-resolution glow of my monitor. There is a specific kind of intellectual satisfaction that comes from being the smartest person in a room full of people who think you are a fool. Julian and Arthur were still operating in a world of paper and handshakes, believing that their family card was an unhackable firewall. They saw me as the dutiful Elena, the one who would cry and then inevitably open her checkbook to save the day. They did not realize that the woman who designed 20-story steel structures had spent her lonely New York nights studying the intricate, cold beauty of Florida's trust and estate laws. I had already calculated the fallout, mapped the legal precedents, and anticipated every desperate lie they would tell me at the dinner table tonight. This was not about a simple house anymore. This was about the structural integrity of a life I had built with my own hands. As I watched the digital timestamp on the latest filing, the one where Julian had officially accepted the deposit from that unsuspecting young couple, I felt a wave of icy calm wash over me. He was so proud of his business acumen, so convinced he had finally outmaneuvered the sister who had always been the benchmark of success in this family. I leaned back in the old wooden chair, the one with the worn-out cushion my mother had stitched by hand, and felt the weight of my laptop like a shield. I was not just observing a transaction. I was presiding over a controlled demolition. They thought I was the architect who would simply help them build their new life on the ruins of my own. But they were wrong. I was not building them a home anymore. I was engineering a cage, and the door had just clicked shut behind them. I leaned back against the headboard of my childhood bed, the rhythmic, clinical hum of my portable printer acting as a soothing metronome in the heavy Florida night. My mind drifted back 6 months to a rainy Tuesday in Manhattan, inside a glass-walled office on the 45th floor of a building that looked out over the Chrysler Building. I had sat across from a trust attorney whose eyes were as sharp as his pinstriped suit. And I didn't go there for a simple consultation. I went there to build a vault. I had explained to him that my father was becoming a puppet, and my brother was the one pulling the strings with a general power of attorney he had coerced the old man into signing during a bout of family solidarity. The lawyer had smiled, a slow, predatory thinness to his lips, and told me that while a power of attorney is a powerful tool, it is only as strong as the title it claims to represent. You cannot sell what you do not own, and you cannot own what has been legally moved into the fortress of an irrevocable trust. The process had been an ASMR for the brain, a series of precise, surgical legal maneuvers that felt like silk sliding over steel. We had spent 3 hours meticulously drafting the language of the Elena Vance Irrevocable Heritage Trust. In this structure, I was the settlor, the one providing the assets, but I was also the sole trustee and the only beneficiary. By transferring the deed of this Florida house, a deed I had effectively earned through a decade of mortgage payments and tax settlements, into the trust, I had removed it from the reach of any future creditors, any gambling debts, and most importantly, any unauthorized sales. An irrevocable trust in the state of Florida is exactly what it sounds like. It is permanent and unchangeable without the trustee's consent. Once the house was inside that legal entity, it was no longer Arthur's personal property to lose, nor was it Julian's to steal. My father had signed the transfer papers months ago during a brief window of lucidity when he was furious at Julian for borrowing his vintage watch and losing it at a poker game. He hadn't fully grasped the nuances of trust law, but he had understood one thing. He was protecting the house from Julian's reach. Or at least, that was the narrative I had allowed him to hold on to while I quietly secured the title. Julian, meanwhile, was walking around downstairs with the general power of attorney, believing he held the master key to our father's life. He thought that because Arthur's name was on the original deed in the hall closet, Arthur's signature, via Julian's hand, could transfer the property to that young couple I saw in the driveway. He was fundamentally wrong. In the eyes of the law, that power of attorney was now a ghost. It was a key to a door that had been replaced by a reinforced brick wall 6 months ago. The technical beauty of the plan lay in Julian's own laziness and arrogance. He had likely used a cut-rate title company or a buddy who wouldn't look past the last recorded deed from 20 years ago, skipping the deep title search that would have revealed the trust filing from last autumn. He was so certain of his victory, so sure that his man-of-the-house status gave him ultimate authority, that he hadn't even checked the foundation of his own scam. The printer hissed as the final page slid out, the ink still warm to the touch. I picked up the heavy, cream-colored paper and ran my thumb over the raised red notary seal, the Vuhi I had been forging in the Manhattan shadows. It felt solid, weighted with the authority of federal statutes and the sheer force of my own architectural will. I wasn't just a woman who designed 20-story steel structures. I was the secret architect of my brother's inevitable collapse. I carefully placed the documents into a translucent blue folder, the color of a Florida sky before a hurricane. To my father and Julian, I was still the quiet, grieving daughter serving tea and taking insults in the kitchen. They saw the su im lang kwa vukso and mistook it for weakness. But inside this folder was the blueprint for a total structural failure of Julian's ego. The ASMR of the clicking printer was the sound of justice being rendered in black and white, one clause at a time. Tomorrow, Julian would invite the buyers over to sign the final contract, believing he was about to collect a six-figure check. He had no idea that he was actually walking into a courtroom I had already built around him. The Florida humidity was already thick enough to chew on by 8 in the morning, but inside the kitchen, the atmosphere was even heavier with the scent of cheap coffee and Julian's unearned confidence. I had spent 20 minutes in front of the bathroom mirror, not to fix my hair, but to perfect the mask of the defeated daughter. I rubbed a bit of redness into the corners of my eyes and allowed my shoulders to slump with the weight of a decade's worth of fake exhaustion. When I walked into the kitchen, I found Julian leaning against the counter, holding a mug of coffee like it was a scepter. He was wearing his $300 linen shirt, his Italian loafers gleaming in the shafts of light cutting through the blinds. He looked at me with a mix of pity and irritation, the way one looks at a broken appliance that's taking up too much space. "You look like hell, Elle," he said, his voice flat and curt, a short, sharp jab meant to keep me off balance. I didn't snap back. I didn't defend myself. I simply sat down at the small breakfast table, my hands trembling ever so slightly as I stared at the wood grain. "Julian," I whispered, making sure my voice was thin and fragile. "I barely slept a wink. I keep thinking about the sold sign. I keep thinking about what Mom said about this house. I've spent 10 years of my life, thousands upon thousands of dollars to keep these walls standing. If you sell this, what happens to the money? What happens to me?" I looked up at him, letting a single, well-timed tear track down my cheek. This was the performance of a lifetime, the ASMR for the brain, where I played the part of the naive victim so he would feel safe enough to reveal the full extent of his greed. Julian didn't even flinch at my tears. Instead, he let out a short, dismissive laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. "Elena, let's be honest. You're a big-shot architect in New York. You've got a high-rise life and a bank account that probably has more zeros than I can count. You don't need this house. You just want to control it because you've always liked playing the martyr for this family." He took a step toward me, his voice taking on that patronizing, "trust me" tone that he always used right before he stole something. "But I'm not a monster. I've talked it over with Dad. Once the house sells for the $600,000 we've agreed on, and after I settle some of the, let's call them family expenses, I'm going to be generous. I'm going to give you 5% of the net proceeds. It should be about $30,000. Consider it a little thank you for the years you sent those checks. It's more than enough for you to rent a nice little studio back in Manhattan for a few months until you get over your midlife crisis." He said it with such smug satisfaction, as if he were a philanthropist handing out bread to the poor, rather than a thief offering back a handful of the gold he had stolen. I let my head drop, burying my face in my hands to hide the grimace of pure, concentrated irony that was threatening to break through my mask. $30,000, I repeated, my voice muffled by my palms. After 10 years of paying the mortgage, the taxes, the repairs, that's all? Julian's voice sharpened, the fake kindness evaporating in an instant. "It's $30,000 more than you'll get if you keep being difficult, Elena. This deal is happening. The buyers and their lawyer are coming over at 10 o'clock sharp to sign the final contract in the living room. Dad has already agreed. He's tired of the fighting, and he's tired of you trying to run his life from 3,000 miles away. Now, go wash your face and try to look like a supportive sister for once. I want this closing to be smooth." He turned his back on me, already checking his reflection in the microwave door, adjusting his collar with a self-satisfied smirk. I stood up slowly, moving with the heavy, deliberate steps of a woman who had lost everything. But as I walked past the hallway toward my room, my hand brushed the blue folder hidden in my briefcase. The trap was set. Julian had spent the morning painting a target on his own chest, and all I had to do was wait for the clock to strike 10. The mahogany dining table, which I had polished until my reflection looked back at me with tired eyes, was set with the fine china I had purchased for my mother's 60th birthday. It was a grotesque stage for the performance Julian was currently directing. The young couple from the driveway, looking scrubbed and eager, sat across from Julian and my father, while their lawyer, a man with a sharp nose and a briefcase that cost more than my first car, looked over the documents. I moved in the periphery, a ghost in my own home, serving iced tea and small plates of appetizers like a silent servant. Julian was holding court, his voice booming with a false, expansive warmth that set my teeth on edge. He gestured toward the high ceilings and the crown molding, the very features I had spent 6 months' salary to restore, as if he were the one who had bled for them. "This house is a piece of history," he said, leaning back with a self-satisfied grin. "And I'm just glad we're passing the torch to a family that appreciates it as much as we have." The young woman looked at me with a fleeting moment of pity, perhaps noticing the way I hovered at the edge of the light. But Julian quickly pulled her attention back. He flourished a leather-bound folder with the dramatic flair of a stage magician. "My father, Arthur, has entrusted me with everything," he announced, casting a glance toward our father, who sat at the head of the table like a hollowed-out tree. "As the sole holder of his general power of attorney, I have the full legal authority to finalize this sale today. We've cleared the title, settled the minor family, shall we say, disagreements, and we are ready to move forward into a new chapter." Arthur didn't speak. He simply gave a slow, rhythmic nod, his eyes fixed on a scratch in the table as if trying to memorize it. It was a sickening display of complicity, a father and son conspiring to erase the daughter who had kept them both afloat. I felt a surge of secret, simmering satisfaction as I watched Julian pull the invisible noose tighter around his own neck with every word he spoke. He was so intoxicated by his own perceived brilliance that he didn't notice the cold, calculating weight of the blue folder I had tucked into the sideboard behind him. The lawyer began to distribute the final contracts, the crisp white pages rustling like dry autumn leaves. The room was filled with the smell of expensive ink and the lingering scent of my mother's favorite lavender soap, a contrast that made my stomach churn. Julian signed his name with a flourish, the pen scratching aggressively against the paper, a sound that felt like it was etching a scar onto the heart of the house. He then pushed a single sheet of paper toward me, a witness statement that would technically acknowledge his authority to sign on our father's behalf. He didn't look at me with love or even regret. He looked at me with the cold triumph of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled roll of $20 bills, tossing them onto the table next to the pen, as if he were tipping a waitress. "Go on, Elena. Sign the witness line so these nice people can get their keys," Julian said, his voice dripping with a patronizing sweetness that made my skin crawl. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of the expensive bourbon he'd been sneakily drinking in the kitchen. "Sign this, and I'll give you enough for a bus ticket back to your little life in the city." He laughed, a short, barking sound that the buyers mistook for a brotherly joke. "You've done your part, honey. Now it's time for the grown-ups to handle the business." I looked at the pen, then at the $20 bills, and finally at my brother's arrogant, grinning face. I felt the within me grow until it filled the entire room. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I straightened my back, shed the mask of the victim, and felt the power of the architect take over. The bridge they had built to their future was made of sand, and I was about to let the tide come in. I did not reach for the pen, and I certainly did not touch the $20 bills Julian had tossed onto the table like a tip for a servant. The silence in the room stretched, becoming thick and heavy, until the only sound was the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I stood up slowly, my movements fluid and precise, shedding the mask of the grieving daughter as if it were an old, out-of-style coat. I reached into the sideboard and pulled out the translucent blue folder, placing it squarely on top of the fraudulent sales contract. The young couple looked confused, and their lawyer's eyes narrowed, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. Julian's smirk didn't vanish immediately. It wavered, flickering like a dying candle as he realized I wasn't following his script. I looked him directly in the eye, not with anger, but with the cold, analytical gaze I used when surveying a condemned building. I spoke in a voice that was low, steady, and utterly devoid of emotion. The whisper of the truth that cuts deeper than a scream. I told them that this house, the land it sat on, and every hydrangea bush in the yard had ceased to be the personal property of Arthur Vance exactly 6 months and 4 days ago. I explained the technical beauty of the Elena Vance Irrevocable Heritage Trust, a legal fortress I had constructed in the high-rise offices of Manhattan while they were busy plotting their small-time heist. This was the ASMR for the brain moment I had prepared for, detailing how I was the sole trustee and the only beneficiary. I watched the blood drain from Julian's face, turning his tanned skin the color of damp ash. I pointed to the recorded deed inside the folder, bearing a timestamp from half a year ago, which proved that Arthur no longer held the title. Consequently, the general power of attorney Julian was wielding so arrogantly was nothing more than a scrap of paper, a key to a lock that had been changed long ago. The buyer's lawyer snatched the documents from the folder, his professional curiosity replaced by a visible, growing dread. As he scanned the notarized seals and the ironclad language of the trust, he looked at Julian not as a seller, but as a liability. I continued my slow reveal, explaining that because they had no legal right to sell the property, every document they had signed today, every wire transfer Julian had solicited, and every promise they had made to these innocent buyers constituted a felony fraud under Florida law. I wasn't just talking about a civil dispute or a family squabble. I was talking about a criminal act with a mandatory minimum sentence. Julian tried to speak, but his voice failed him, coming out as a wet, desperate wheeze. He looked at Arthur, who was now trembling so violently that his tea rattled in the saucer, but there was no sanctuary to be found in the old man's eyes. The arrogance that had defined Julian for 40 years vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by a raw, naked fear that was almost pathetic to witness. He looked at the contracts he had just signed, evidence of his own crime, and his hands began to shake. The young couple sat frozen, the realization dawning on them that they had almost handed their life savings to a con artist. I leaned over the table, my shadow falling across my brother's face, and delivered the ultimatum I had engineered with surgical precision. I told them that my own legal team and the local authorities were already briefed and waiting for my signal. They had two choices, and they had to make them before the clock struck 11. They could immediately return the earnest money to the buyers, void every fraudulent agreement, and Julian would leave this house with nothing but the clothes on his back. Or they could wait for the sirens I was ready to call, and Julian could spend the next 10 years explaining his business ventures to a cellmate in a state penitentiary. I sat back, watching the utter collapse of the parasite's empire. There was no shouting, no threats of violence, only the crushing weight of reality. Julian's Italian loafers suddenly looked cheap, and his linen shirt looked like a shroud. He looked at me, perhaps seeing his sister for the first time as a person rather than a resource, and he found no mercy in my silence of the deep. I had built this trap with the same care I used to build the skyscraper, and it was holding perfectly. I simply waited for him to break, knowing that the foundation of his life was made of nothing but dust and lies, while mine was built on a promise I had finally, fully kept. The showdown was over before it had even truly begun, and the blueprint of my life was finally clear of their shadows. The room erupted into a controlled chaos that felt like music to my ears. The buyer's lawyer was already on his phone, his voice sharp with the vocabulary of litigation, while the young couple looked at Julian with a mixture of horror and pure, unadulterated loathing. "You tried to sell us a house you didn't even own?" the young man barked, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson as he paced the mahogany floor. "We transferred the earnest money deposit yesterday. If that money isn't back in our escrow account by tomorrow morning, I don't care about your family drama. I'm calling the district attorney and filing a police report for grand larceny." Julian was no longer the smug businessman in the linen shirt. He was a cornered animal, his eyes darting toward the door as if he could run away from the mountain of debt and the immediate threat of a prison cell. He turned to me, his hand shaking so violently that he nearly knocked over his iced tea. "Elena, please," he stammered, his voice cracking like dry wood under the weight of a storm. "You have to tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them the trust was just a formality you set up for tax reasons. You can fix this. You've always fixed everything for me. I'm your brother, for God's sake. We're blood." I stood there, watching him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a dying specimen. The blood he was so desperate to claim now was the same blood I had poured into this house while he was bleeding us dry at the poker tables in Las Vegas. My father, Arthur, finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a pathetic, trembling whine that grated on my nerves. He reached out to grab my sleeve, his eyes moist with the calculated tears he had used to control my sense of duty for decades. "Elena, be reasonable," he whispered, invoking the ancient, heavy weight of family obligation that had nearly crushed me. "He's your only brother. You can't let him go to jail over a pile of bricks and mortar. Think of your mother's memory. Think of the family name. We're all we have left. You have to save him one last time. It's the Christian thing to do. It's what a good daughter does. He was playing the blood card, the sacred bond of blood, as if it were a get-out-of-jail-free card, completely ignoring the fact that he had been the silent accomplice while Julian sharpened the knife they had driven into my back. I pulled my arm away from his grasp with a slow, deliberate motion that carried the weight of 10 years of silent, accumulated resentment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to, for the truth was loud enough to fill every corner of the house. I looked at Arthur, then at Julian, and I felt nothing but a vast, empty space where my loyalty used to be. The family name was the first thing you mortgaged, Julian, I said, my words cold and surgical, cutting through his desperate excuses. And the blood you're talking about is the blood I've been giving you in monthly installments for a decade. You didn't care about blood when you forged my father's intent. You didn't care about Mom's legacy when you invited these people here today to help you steal the very roof over my head. I paused, letting the silence of the deep gulf between us settle over the room like ash after a fire. You keep asking for my kindness, Julian, but you forgot one thing about architectural structures. Every beam has a load-bearing limit. My kindness expired the day I saw that sold sign on the lawn. The finality of my words seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. The buyer's lawyer gave me a curt, respectful nod, a professional recognizing a superior strategy, and led his clients out of the house, promising Julian a legal storm the likes of which Florida had never seen. I didn't wait for the front door to click shut before I pointed toward the hallway, my eyes fixed on my brother. You have exactly 1 hour, Julian, I said, my voice as unyielding as the steel I use to reinforce my skyscrapers. Take whatever is yours. Leave the keys on the sideboard. If you are still on this property 61 minutes from now, I won't be the one calling the police. The trust's legal counsel will, and I can assure you they don't share my sense of nostalgia. Julian tried to argue, tried to bluster one last time, but he was a man made of paper standing in the path of a hurricane. By 11 o'clock that night, under the harsh, unforgiving glow of the porch light, I watched my brother drag a single, tattered suitcase down the gravel driveway. He looked small, broken, and utterly pathetic, a shadow of the man who had mocked my midlife crisis just that morning. Arthur sat in his recliner in the dark living room, staring at a blank television screen as if waiting for a miracle that would never come. He was a man who had sold his daughter's soul for the comfort of a son's lies, and now he was left with nothing but the silence of an empty house and a daughter who no longer recognized him as her master. I stood on the porch, the Florida humidity clinging to my skin, and watched Julian's taillights disappear into the darkness of the street. The parasite was finally gone, but the rot he had caused had been deep and systemic. I felt no joy in his departure, only a profound sense of relief, like a fever finally breaking after a long, agonizing night. I was an architect, and I had just finished the most difficult demolition of my entire career. Now, as the crickets began their rhythmic song in the hydrangeas, the real work, the work of rebuilding a life on a foundation of truth rather than sacrifice, was finally ready to begin. 6 months have passed since the night the gravel driveway echoed with the sound of a single, tattered suitcase being dragged toward the street. And today, the Florida air feels different, lighter, as if the house itself has finally exhaled. I am sitting on the porch, the same one where Julian once stood in his $300 shirt, but the dust has settled into a peaceful silence. The sold sign is a distant, ugly memory, replaced by the vibrant, blooming hydrangeas that I personally pruned back into health. I spend 2 weekends a month here now, flying down from New York not out of a desperate, suffocating obligation, but because this piece of earth is finally mine to enjoy. There is no more dread when the phone rings, no more frantic wire transfers to cover mysterious business ventures, and no more parasitic shadows looming in the corners of the living room. The house is clean, both literally and spiritually, stripped of the greed and manipulation that had rotted its core for so long. My father, Arthur, is still here, but our world has been redesigned with the precision of a structural blueprint. He sits in the sunroom most mornings, his hands no longer shaking quite as much as they did during the showdown, though he is a quieter, humbler version of the man I once knew. We have established a new foundation. He is allowed to stay in his home, but the family card has been permanently revoked. I manage every cent of the household budget, every tax filing, and every repair through a strictly monitored trust account. He no longer has the power to sign away my mother's legacy, and he knows it. When I look at him now, I don't feel the sharp, jagged edges of anger or the heavy weight of resentment. I feel a quiet, distant sort of pity. He is a man who chose the wrong son and the wrong values, and now he must live in the quiet reality of that choice, safely cared for, but no longer in control. The room at the top of the stairs, the one that used to smell of illness and forgotten promises, is currently filled with the scent of fresh sawdust and white oak. I have spent the last 12 weeks personally overseeing its transformation into a library. The old peeling wallpaper is gone, replaced by floor-to-ceiling shelves that will hold my mother's collection of first editions and my own architectural journals. It is a space dedicated to knowledge and peace, a sanctuary built within the walls that were almost stolen. As for Julian, I hear his name mentioned only in passing now, usually in hushed tones by the few relatives who still take his calls. He is reportedly working a service job in a neighboring county, living in a small apartment and finally facing the reality of a life without a safety net. I wish him no ill will, for that would require an emotional investment I am no longer willing to make. I simply hope he finds the character he lacks in the struggle he finally owns. As the sun begins to set over the Florida pines, casting long, golden shadows across the porch, I feel a sense of rebirth that I didn't think was possible in my 50s. I have spent my entire life building structures for other people, ensuring that their homes were stable and their office towers were secure, while my own internal walls were crumbling under the weight of family loyalty. But I am an architect, and I have finally learned that the most important construction project is the one you live inside. I lean back in my chair, listening to the rhythmic sound of the cicadas and the soft rustle of the leaves. And for the first time in 10 years, I am not thinking about the next crisis or the next debt. I am simply thinking about the beauty of a well-placed boundary. I am an architect, and the greatest work I ever built wasn't made of steel or stone. It was the boundary of my own soul, a structure that is now, finally, unbreakable. Elena's story is a powerful reminder that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's the quiet sound of a master strategist at work. She didn't seek revenge. She sought structural integrity for her life. To our listeners, your hard work is your legacy. Don't let family ties become the chains that allow others to drag you down. Protect your peace, your finances, and your boundaries with the same precision Elena used. You are the architect of your own truth. How did you feel when Elena finally put that folder on the table? Was it the relief you were waiting for? What lesson will you take from this story into your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below, hit that like button, and let's keep the conversation going.